Hey everybody, welcome back to Tim Travels. It's Terry, your host. So I'm here in Pittston. I came just to stop for 10 or 14 hours or whatever on my way to Vermont, but a strange thing happened on the way to the forum. So the first thing that happened is I came in and the pit crew went to work on my trailer tires, but then they left off the airline that inflates the tires coming from the hub. And I didn't know that this was a thing, but they said, oh, well, that's because, we can't get it threaded back on. And I kind of was like, it came off there, it should have been able to go back on, even if it was cross-threaded, but whatever. So they stuffed a piece of paper in the hole coming out of the hub. But here's the problem. They didn't tell me. So, when I started up my truck to get out of the inbound, I was like, dang, I got no air pressure, so I had to wait for it to build up. Then I went over to the truck wash, and when I was started up to get out of the truck wash, again, no air pressure, below 60 pounds. And so I'm like, they did something wrong, So I get out and I look at it and I'm like, what the crap, So in the meantime, I start seeing steam coming out of my engine. Now, normally I wouldn't think much of that after I had a truck wash, but it kind of kept doing it. So I drive back over to inbound to get them to fix this, and they're like, oh, we can't fix that. It has to go to the trailer shop. And so then I have to drive back over to the trailer shop, but I noticed my water temp was 200, and I'm like, I'm just sitting here, I'm not doing anything. It's not that hot out today, and I'm just putting around the yard. I got plenty of coolant in my reservoir. So I pop the hood open and I see that I got not a ton of steam like you see on the side of the road, but I got steam coming out from the base of the radiator. So now I'm waiting to get into the tractor shop so they can kind of troubleshoot that. I couldn't see where there was a leak, but I've not had this happen before, so I don't know if I'm gonna have to get my load repowered or if we could push the appointment back. In any event, I need to get out of here by about midnight if I'm going to deliver on time. So, see what happens. Okay, so 1,586 subscribers. Interesting year, 1586. A lot of stuff happened. Although, I shouldn't say it like there was more happening in 1586 than there was in, say, 1386. It's just we have more recorded history. But anyway, so something of note that happened in September that year. On September 20th and 21st, there was two different sets of mass executions in London. And these were the executions of the 14 plotters in what was called the Babington Plot. Now, the Babington Plot was a plot to assassinate Queen Elizabeth I, who was the Protestant monarch of England, and to place her cousin, once removed, Mary, Queen of Scots, who was a Catholic, back on the throne to basically reinstitute a Catholic monarchy in England. And by this point, Mary was already locked up, and she had been locked up on orders of Elizabeth. And so these conspirators were all Catholics, and they were trying to get, actually figure out how to murder Elizabeth I, but also to get Spain to come in and help reestablish Catholicism as the religion of the monarch in England and install Mary as the queen. Obviously, since we're talking about it, they were caught. They were rooted out by a guy named Walsingham, who was he was like the minister of state, but also he was like the spy chief for Elizabeth I. But here's what happened. So on the 20th, so they sentenced all these guys to death. And it was a 3-part sentence. So death wasn't good enough, right? So they were sentenced to hang, then be drawn, which is disemboweled. I couldn't remember drawn, and then quartered, right, which is basically butchered. But what happened was the first day, and these were very public executions because the Queen wanted everybody to know, here's what happens if you try to plot to kill me. The first day, the 7 that were hung were drawn while they were still alive. So they didn't really hang them, like, I don't think, from a gallows, like we would think, where the design of the instrument is to break the executed's neck. It was, I think it was more like they put a rope around their neck and then like dragged them up. So in other words, they pulled them up by their necks with a rope around it. Well, that takes a lot longer to kill you than just having you fall through a trap door and have your neck snapped. So while they were elevated, hanging, they were also gutted. But apparently, even though things were done pretty gruesomely back then, the crowds in London were just horrified. So Elizabeth slightly modified the death sentences for the other 7 who were scheduled to be executed the following day on the 21st of September. And she said that they had to be hung until it was clear that they were already dead. Then you could cut their guts out and chop them up. So anyway, just good news all the way around. And by the way, after, you may know the story of Mary. Mary was eventually beheaded, but she was tried after these conspirators were executed. And, you know, she was found guilty and sentenced to death. But she wasn't actually executed until the following February, so February of 1587. And she was beheaded. And apparently it was a big deal because like 300 people showed up for this. And those witnesses probably weren't the general public, because her execution would have enraged a lot of people. But the people that saw it were probably courtiers and you know, politicians and stuff. Also in 1586, I talked about him last time. Francis Drake raided St. Augustine, Florida, and although it wasn't, I don't think it was called Florida then, but it was St. Augustine, because that St. Augustine is like the earliest settlement, you know, like place on the American continent, oldest city, I guess you'd say. So he raided St. Augustine, because keep in mind, John Smith didn't go to Jamestown till maybe around 1620s, early 1620s. The Mayflower went to Massachusetts in 1620, so we're talking several years before that. So anyway, he raids St. Augustine and Santo Domingo, which is now capital of the Dominican Republic, also in 1586. Okay, so give me one second. Okay, sorry about that. So something a little bit closer to modern times. There was a survey, I think it's the Annenberg Center for Government, did a survey recently. And it's basically a civic survey of Americans. And I'm not going to go into all the results of the survey, but I'm going to talk about 3 different things. So of the people surveyed, less than half of them, less than 50%, could name all three branches of government. You know, I don't know exactly how the question is phrased. I mean, the answer is executive, legislative, judicial. I don't know if they would have accepted, you know, Congress, the Supreme Court, and the president, you know. But anyway, you know, less than half could name all three branches of government. And around 25% could not even name one branch of government. Now, keep in mind, these are actual Americans that were surveyed. And then the other one that kind of, because you know, it comes up all the time, they ask questions about the First Amendment. And I think I might have mentioned this in the past, but I had a professor in law school named David Bogan, B-O-G-N, and he wrote a book called Bulwark, which is spelled like bulwark, Bulwark of Freedom. And by the way, if you don't know what a bulwark is, it's a wall on a ship that prevents water from, like, you know, smashing stuff that's on deck. That's a bulwark. But he called the First Amendment the Bulwark of Freedom in his book. And there was a decline in the number of people, and they didn't quantify this, but it doesn't really matter. There was a decline in the number of people who could name any of the freedoms or rights, however you want to say it, guaranteed to us in the First Amendment to the Constitution. And for those of you keeping score at home, let's just go over them really quick, right? First Amendment says the government cannot establish a church. That's called the Establishment Clause. The second is the government cannot prevent you from practicing your religion. That's called the Free Exercise Clause. The next one is there's a freedom of assembly, right? In other words, you can get together with people. And also part of this is freedom of association, right? And there are a few restrictions on each of these, right? There have been a gazillion Supreme Court cases about the First Amendment. One that I can think of on freedom of assembly or association is convicted felons that are not supposed to hang out with other convicted felons. So that is a restriction that's, I'm sure, has been deemed lawful. The next is freedom of expression and freedom of press. Now, those are sometimes considered the same right, but I'm not sure I think they are. Freedom of expression is what people often call freedom of speech, but that covers all sorts of stuff, but not necessarily press. Like, it covers artwork, it covers songs, it covers pornography, it covers tons of different things that are considered expression or speech. But there are restrictions on commercial speech, for example, on like what you can say on a billboard and stuff, and who you can target and when things can be advertised, etc. But freedom of the press is to me, it's a separate category, and the reason I say that is because the press has certain constraints, like they can't, you know, like they have rules that they have to live by, which have also been Supreme Court cases. The famous one is a New York Times case over printing something about a public figure, and in fact, Sarah Palin just had a lawsuit dismissed against, I believe, the New York Times, or maybe might have been some other news organization, where they printed something about her. And the reason that she wouldn't prevail in her case, whereas a non-celebrity person, non-politician might have, is because there are exceptions for public figures. And I don't want to get too deep into this, but I did know that there was a reporter last weekend murdered in Las Vegas. And the interesting thing was, he was kind of an investigative reporter. But he was murdered by a guy who was in an elected administrator position out there. This guy was actually, he was an elected Democrat. I don't know that it necessarily matters, but I'll say it just be fair and balanced. But the allegations against the guy, the murderer, was, that he ran a crappy office and didn't do a good job, and he might have been sexually harassing some employees of that office. And then this guy lost in the Democratic primary for his re-election. But it's just crazy that he would, commit a murder over that. It's kind of chilling, and it's really... And I got to say this, the press, whatever you think of them, they have uncovered so many things that I think people forget that it was them who got the ball rolling. Watergate, it was the press. It wasn't the FBI or Congress. It was the Washington Post, Bob Woodward, and Carl Bernstein. The press uncovered all sorts of stuff about, chicanery in Vietnam. The press has uncovered, millions of stories of corruption. They really are essential to a functioning democracy. And even if you don't like somebody, a news organization, understanding that and by the way, I've over the years met several reporters. I've been interviewed for different publications, and the reporters I know are all very careful. And I've had a lot of interaction with them about pieces they've written, whether I agreed with it or disagreed with it. They're all typically very careful. They don't say stuff if they can't back it up. So anyway, that's freedom of the press. And then the last one, so maybe this is number 5 or maybe it's number 6 in the First Amendment, is the right to petition the government for redress of grievances. Okay, so those are the 5 things in the First Amendment. A lot of people seem to know the Second Amendment, but not many people know the First Amendment. Okay, so... or the 8th, or the 3rd. Do you know what the 3rd is? It says the military cannot quarter troops in your home. It's the quartering. So, if somebody from the Army knocks on your door and is like, hey, you gotta let these soldiers stay here overnight and drink your beer and eat your Oreos, you'd be like, no, I got the 3rd Amendment. Go somewhere else. So anyway, I wanted to talk about where should you live when you drive a truck. And I kind of want to break this down, right? Because there are different answers depending on what you do for a living. Now, obviously, if you drive a truck locally, then it's probably a good idea to live locally. In other words, if you drive a truck in the Chicagoland area, then I'm guessing it would make sense to live in the Chicagoland area and not commute from St. Louis every day. Or if you drive a truck for the government, for the city or the county or the state highway department, obviously that's a local job. But let's say you're an over-the-road truck driver. Where can you live, and what places might be better places to live for your pocketbook not in terms of cost of living, right? But in terms of availability of loads and stuff. So I was thinking about this, and Prime, for example, and many companies have geographic restrictions on where drivers can live. Now, some of them are like really kind of odd. I've even seen trucks go by and they're like, do you live in this area? And it's like just like you gave a first grader a crayon and gave them a map of the United States and said, hey, draw some lines on this. And it's just, like some wavy line going in a big kind of semicircle around, the Northeast or the Midwest or whatever. And other companies, you know, like I was, when I went to GP Transco, there was a guy in my orientation class from Miami, and I was kind of surprised that this happened at orientation, but they're like, you know, where do you live? And they're asking people, and, you know, I was like, oh, I live in Pennsylvania, and then somebody else said, oh, I live in, you know, Missouri or whatever. And this guy says he lives in Miami. And the operations guy was like, oh, so when you go on home time, just bring the truck back here, which was to Joliet, Illinois, and you could take a plane home. And I don't think he meant that the company was paying for that. But they didn't want their trucks in South Florida. And I've talked about business out of Florida generally a bunch of times. And it was also my understanding, and I don't know because I don't talk to recruiting often, but it was my understanding that for a while we weren't, Prime either wasn't recruiting people from Florida at all, or at least like south of, you know, maybe like I-4, or, you know, draw a line across the state or whatever. But South Florida, they didn't want drivers from South Florida. I don't know if that's the case anymore. Maybe somebody can put something in the comments about that. But I wanted to talk about the 5 cities, or the 5 metro areas that have the most outbound loads. And this is across the board. So we're talking reefer, dry-van, flatbed, across the board, most outbound loads. And some of them may surprise you, some of them won't. But let me set this up a little bit. The reason that I'm interested in this is because when I go on home time, it just so happens that I live very near one of these areas. But what I see it as an advantage, and by the way, I've met drivers at Prime from all over the country. But if you're a lease operator, right, then, you know, I mean, you can live anywhere. Although I did meet a guy from Hawaii who Prime said, oh, you got to get your CDL in, you know, like some other state. And I'm like, why? I didn't understand that. I'm like, who cares where his CDL's from? I mean, but I guess they were like, well, you can't take the truck home to Hawaii. And I get that. The tunnel from San Diego to Hilo, or to the Big Island, is expensive. I know that. I took a load out there. And so I get that, but I didn't know why they really cared if his CDL was from Hawaii. But whatever. I met him in Salt Lake. He watches the channel, and he said he just moved in with like some family members in Oregon and got his CDL there. But anyway, I mean, he got it through Prime, but he was domiciled in Oregon for CDL purposes. But anyway, I was one of the things that I always think about is, you know, like, how much am I paying to get to where I want to be, right? Because if you don't have a load, let's say you live in Billings, Montana, okay? I've taken loads to Billings, but they were dry van loads. And I didn't get anything out of there. I had to go to like frickin' Idaho to get a load. That was the closest place I could go. So, you know, it might be really cool to live in Billings. I mean, Montana's a beautiful place. I think it's probably a great place to live. But are you going to be, you know, every time you want to take home time, are you going to be like, well, I'm just going to leave my truck in Salt Lake and fly home? Or are you going to be like, hey, I'm going to drive my truck home, but I might have, you know, a 400-mile deadhead after I drop, and then I might have another 400-mile deadhead or 500 miles to get to a place to pick up? And that's a question that you got to answer for yourself. But if you're saying, hey, because I met drivers who have lived one place but said, yeah, once I kind of get my feet under me, I'm going to move to another place, because this career does give you a lot of freedom. It's kind of like you can move wherever you want because your job isn't you're not tied to a location. Your job is going from place to place. So as long as you go place to place, that's how you make money. It doesn't really matter where you live. But if you're looking for a place that's going to have a lot of inbound and especially outbound loads, because a lot of times you can get close to a place, like even Florida, right? You can get in there because people got to eat. But coming out, there's not a ton of stuff unless it's orange juice or flowers. Let's be candid, right? And so you're limited on what you can bring out of certain places. Probably same thing with Montana. I mean, I'm sure somebody from Prime is hauled in and out of Montana. I never have. So I mean, I'm guessing there's something there, but I don't know for sure. Same with the Dakotas. There's a lot of places that are kind of deserts. I mean, even Denver, where my good friend Lyle lives, he lives in Centennial, but Denver is known as a desert coming out for outbound freight, outbound cargo. But so these are the 5 biggest outbound places. First one, Los Angeles. Not a surprise there, although I always kind of thought, well, I know there's a lot going into Los Angeles, but there is a lot coming out just because of the port of Los Angeles and Long Beach. So there's a lot coming out. The second place, Dallas, Texas. I don't really care for running into Texas, and I've never really felt like the loads going in or out of Texas were that worthwhile. A lot of people live in Texas, so there's certainly a lot of stuff going in there, but I don't think that it gets the premium it should, because candidly, I would much rather run into Southern Cal than into like the Houston area. It's easier to work with. So anyway, Dallas, big area for outbound shipments. Next area, Chicago. That should make sense to everybody. Chicago has, since a long time, Chicago's been a transit hub. It still is. Every major railroad in North America runs into Chicago. And when I say every, I mean even Canadian Pacific, Canadian National, everybody runs in there. Chicago is home, Chicagoland, so the metro area, home to a gazillion trucking companies. And it's kind of like Dallas in that it's it's kind of one of those spots kind of on the way to other places too. So it's a huge outbound area. Although I used to haul a lot outbound there when I was at GP Transco. Of course, GP is located outside of Chicago. Not so much at Prime, but Chicago is Chicagoland, so think, maybe like Milwaukee, all the, out towards DeKalb, all the way around to like Gary, Indiana, that whole area. The next area, number 4, is Atlanta, Georgia. Again, Atlanta has always been a lot of crossroads, a lot of transportation. That's why, the Union Army went in there and tore the place up. Chicago wasn't in play, but, Sherman tore the place up, and on his way from Atlanta to the sea towards Savannah, I've seen pictures of, they call them Sherman bow ties, where the Union troops would rip up the railroad ties, stack them up, and then they'd get the rails and put them over the top, so it kind of looked like a teeter-totter, but then they'd get soldiers on either side and bend the rails so they couldn't be reused. And then they probably set fire to the ties too, I don't know. But without the rails, what good are the ties? So, so Atlanta, a big outbound hub. And there's quite a lot of stuff coming out of Atlanta. I'm not a big, don't get me wrong. I like the Atlanta area. I like Northwest Georgia. I have friends down there, friends in Athens. There's a lot to like down there. but man, the traffic sucks. It's, you know, Houston level suckage on the traffic. And by the way, Los Angeles and Chicago, I don't mind driving those areas at all. I mean, they're big cities, but, you know, like I was in Chicago the other day. It doesn't bother me that much. In fact, I drove right through. I drove the Bishop Ford to the Dan Ryan to the Stevenson. So I'm talking like right south of downtown, and then that's the way I went out. And I got in some traffic congestion, but I just don't, Chicago never bothered me. And then the last area, number 5, and this is the one that I live near, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Now, the interesting thing about Harrisburg, of course, Harrisburg tends to be the place, like once you get to Harrisburg, you start seeing the just massive amount of distribution centers and stuff that feed into the greater New York area, with the tri-state area, New Jersey. I don't know how big it's considered, but I know that if you include like Carlisle, Harrisburg, Hershey, those areas in the Harrisburg metro area, and then also York, Lancaster, going down towards, you know, going a little bit farther south towards Baltimore, there's just a ton of stuff coming out of there. And again, warehouses everywhere and more under construction. And the nice thing about Harrisburg compared to the other 4 that I've named is you don't have, you know, obviously I'm up here in Pittston, so I'm not that far from Harrisburg, right? You don't have the traffic like you do in other places. 81, 83, and the PA Turnpike 76 all kind of run through Harrisburg. Harrisburg's a big rail hub, mostly though for Norfolk Southern. CSX is not really in Harrisburg, but it's always kind of been a transportation hub in central PA. And the cost of living is not horrible in the Harrisburg area, south central PA and stuff. So anyway, when you're thinking about, you know, if you're gonna move and you're concerned about, you know, getting stuff in and out, you know, you might want to think about these things. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with any of these 5 places, or you couldn't make it work in lots of other places. But I'm pretty sure that you're going to have a much more target-rich environment if you're near, or if you're in the metro area of one of those 5 places I named. So LA, and I would include the Inland Empire, LA Basin, basically. So think, you know, LA County, Riverside County, San Bernardino County, maybe a little bit of Ventura County. Dallas, so Dallas Metroplex, so Dallas-Fort Worth area, Atlanta, Chicagoland, and like I said, Milwaukee maybe, all the way around to down by Gary, Indiana, and then the Harrisburg area. So I'm happy to answer any questions. I don't know that I'm an expert on this, but I like to not have to, like, you know, deadhead too far unless it's really going to pay well. You know, and I have deadheaded from Salt Lake City to freaking Salinas before, and it paid well. So I mean, I guess it's there, you know. But anyway, I just wanted to share that with you. I thought it was a little bit interesting, and you know, maybe it does impact some people's decisions. It's easier to get home time when you're in a place where there's lots of loads going in and out, especially if you're a company driver. So anyway, thanks for tuning in. We'll talk to you soon. Bye.